Welcome to Relative, our family mess. Here, I bring you the raw, unspoken stories of older men betrayed by the very families they spent a lifetime protecting, and the dark secrets hidden within the modern home. Now, here is today's story. My name is Ameer Alexander. For 39 years, I worked homicide for the Chicago Police Department, and I learned one thing above all others. People rarely show you the moment they decide to destroy you. They show you a smile. They show you a gift. The real decision is made somewhere quiet, behind a closed door, in a voice they think you cannot hear. I should have remembered that the night my son's girlfriend handed me a small white bottle and called it medicine. It was a cold October evening, the kind where the wind off Lake Michigan finds every gap in an old house. I was 68 years old, sitting in the same kitchen where my wife Megan had cooked 30 Thanksgivings before the cancer took her 12 years ago now. Since then, the house had grown too large and too silent. I filled the silence the only way I knew how. I read old case files. I fixed things that were not broken. And on Sundays, I waited for my grandson, King, to call. King was 9 years old, and he was the last clean thing left in my life. Everything I had saved, nearly $1 million earned across 4 decades of overtime and night shifts, I had set aside for him. Not for his father. For him. His father, my son Casey, had become a stranger to me long before that October night. Casey had my last name and his mother's soft heart, but somewhere along the way he had lost the spine that should have come with both. He drifted between jobs and bad investments, and every time he fell, he called me. And every time he called, I caught him. I told myself that was love. Now I understand it was something closer to cowardice. I'd been too afraid to let my own son feel the weight of his own choices. Then Lila Decker walked into his life, and into mine. She arrived on his arm one spring afternoon, all warmth and bright eyes and a handshake that lingered half a second too long. She called herself a wellness and financial consultant. She remembered the name of my late wife by our second meeting, and she touched my arm when she said it, like the grief was hers too. A younger man might have been charmed, but I had spent 4 decades watching people perform sincerity. And something in the back of my mind, the old detective's quiet itch, refused to settle. I had no evidence, only an itch. So I said nothing, and I watched. That October night, Lila had come to dinner with Casey, and she brought me a gift. She set the small white bottle on the kitchen table with both hands, the way you place something precious. The label was glossy and expensive, printed with words like advanced cognitive support and premium neural formula. She told me she had been reading about memory health in men my age. She said she only wanted to help me stay sharp, to protect the mind of a man who had given so much to so many. Her voice was honey. Her eyes were wet. And for one moment, even I almost believed her. I thanked her. I turned the bottle over in my hands, feeling the smooth plastic, and I told her it was very thoughtful. Casey would not look at me when I said it. He stared into his wine glass like there was an answer floating in it. After dinner, I excused myself and walked toward the hallway bathroom. The house was old, and sound traveled through it the way water travels through cracked concrete, finding the seams. The kitchen door had swung half shut behind me. I was 3 steps down the dark hallway when I heard Lila's voice change. The honey was gone. What replaced it was something flat and fast and entirely without warmth. She was speaking low, to Casey, thinking I was out of range. I stopped. I did not breathe. 39 years of standing outside closed doors had taught my body how to go perfectly still. I caught only a fragment. She said the bottle was the easy part. She said that once it started working, no judge in the county would side with the old man. Then she said something about a hearing and a date, and a number with too many zeros to be anything but mine. I stood in the dark hallway, an old man holding nothing but a fragment of a sentence, the way I had once stood over evidence at a crime scene, before I understood what I was looking at. I did not yet know what was in that bottle. I did not yet know how deep it went, or how far they were willing to go. But I knew one thing with the cold certainty of a man who had read 1,000 confessions. The gift in my kitchen was not a gift at all. It was the first move in someone else's plan to make me disappear, and they had no idea who they had just decided to erase. I did not stop taking the pills. That is the part I am least proud of. A younger detective would have acted on instinct that very night, but I was an old man who wanted, more than anything, to be wrong. I wanted the fragment I had overheard to be a misunderstanding, a bad joke, a sentence torn out of some harmless context. So I told myself I had heard wrong, and the next morning I shook 2 white capsules into my palm and swallowed them with my coffee. I've asked myself 1,000 times since why I did that. The honest answer is that believing my son wanted me dead was harder than swallowing poison. So I chose the poison. The first week, nothing happened. The second week, the world began to tilt. It started small, the way real damage always does. A wave of dizziness while I was reaching for a coffee mug, my hand closing on empty air an inch from the handle. A name I had known for 40 years, sitting just out of reach on my tongue. I blamed my age. I told myself this was simply what 68 felt like, that I had been lucky for too long. But the third week frightened me. I woke at 3 a.m, standing in my own living room, with no memory of how I had gotten out of bed. The lamp was on. The front door was unlocked. My heart was hammering against my ribs in a fast, sick rhythm I had never felt before, like a fist pounding to be let out. I stood there in the dark, barefoot on the cold floor, and for one terrible moment, I could not remember the year. I could not remember whether Megan was alive or dead. When the fog cleared, I was shaking. Not from fear, from something chemical. Something moving through my blood that did not belong there. I sat down at the kitchen table and did what I had always done at a scene that made no sense. I stopped reacting, and I started observing. I looked at my own hands trembling on the wood, and I treated them as evidence. A man does not wake at 68 with a healthy heart and lose 3 hours of his life to a darkness he cannot name, not without a cause. And in my experience, when symptoms arrive on a schedule, someone is keeping the schedule. 2 days later, Lila and Casey came by, and the second half of the plan revealed itself. Lila made tea and sat across from me with that soft, pitying expression she had begun to wear. She asked, very gently, whether I had been feeling confused lately. She said Casey had mentioned I seemed forgetful on the phone. She said it must be so frightening, getting older alone in a big, empty house, with no one to notice if something went wrong. Casey would not meet my eyes. He sat at the end of the table, my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle on Kedzie Avenue, and he studied the grain of the wood like it owed him money. Then Lila said the word out loud, soft as a feather and heavy as a tombstone. Dementia. She said it the way you plant a seed, carefully, in soil you have already prepared. I understood then that the symptoms were not the whole crime. They were only the evidence being manufactured. The dizziness, the lost hours, the trembling hands, these were not meant to kill me. They were meant to be witnessed. They were meant to build a story, told to doctors and judges, about an old man who could no longer be trusted with his own life or his own money. I had spent 4 decades learning how a frame is built. You do not simply accuse a man. You arrange the facts around him until the lie tells itself. Lila was not poisoning my body. She was poisoning my record. I smiled at her across the table. I told her she might be right, that I had been feeling my age. I let her believe the seed had taken root. Inside, the old machine was waking up. The part of me that had outlasted 4 divorces among my colleagues, 3 commendations, and 1 bullet to the shoulder. The part Megan used to call my cold engine, turned over once and caught. That night, alone, I held the white bottle up to the kitchen light and turned it slowly in my fingers, reading the glossy lies on the label. I had told myself for 3 weeks that the timing was a coincidence, but I had spent a lifetime learning a hard truth about that word. Coincidence is not an answer. Coincidence is only a lead I have not followed yet, and I was finally, dangerously, ready to follow it. The next morning I poured my coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and did not take the pills. It was the simplest act of resistance of my life, and the most important. For 3 weeks I had been swallowing the evidence against me. That morning, I started preserving it instead. I found an old glass spice jar in the back of a cabinet, one Megan had filled with cinnamon a decade ago. I washed it, dried it, and with a pair of tweezers, I dropped 2 of the white capsules inside and sealed the lid. Then I labeled it with the date in my own hand, the way I had labeled 1,000 bags at 1,000 scenes. Chain of custody. If a thing is ever going to mean something in a courtroom, you have to be able to prove where it has been every minute since you touched it. I hid the jar inside a coffee can on the highest shelf, behind 40 years of clutter no one would ever bother to search. Then I kept taking the bottle out and putting it back where Lila expected to see it, 2 capsules lighter each day, so the count would match a man who was still obediently poisoning himself. That is the difference between a victim and an investigator. A victim reacts. An investigator performs. By the 3rd day off the pills, the fog began to lift. The dizziness faded. My heart settled back into the slow, steady rhythm it had kept for 68 years. The nights went quiet again. And every hour that my mind cleared was another data point. Another line on a chart only I could see. Symptoms present when the dose was present. Symptoms gone when the dose was gone. In my old life, I had sent men to prison on correlations weaker than that, but a correlation is not a conviction. I needed to know what was actually in those capsules, and I could not simply walk a homemade jar into a police lab, not when the suspects were my own family. Not when one wrong move would turn me into exactly what they were claiming I already was. A confused old man, making wild accusations, seeing poison in a gift of vitamins. I could hear the story they would tell. I had to be quieter than that, so I watched, and I waited, and I gathered. I started keeping a notebook, the small spiral kind I had carried for 4 decades. I wrote down the days Lila visited and the days the symptoms had been worst. I wrote down the questions she asked, always circling back to my memory, my money, my will. I noticed how she had begun to mention, lightly, that her cousin worked in elder care. I noticed how Casey had stopped arguing with her about anything at all, and I noticed the way they looked at the house, not the way you look at a home. The way you look at a property. One evening, Lila lingered by the framed photographs on the mantel. The ones of Megan, of Casey as a boy, of King. She picked up the picture of my grandson and asked, in that gentle voice, whether I'd given any thought to who would manage things for King if my health declined. She said it so kindly. She said it like a daughter. I told her I had not thought about it. I told her I supposed I should. I let my voice wander a little, let a pause sit too long, gave her the small, frightened performance she was paying for in capsules. But inside, I was writing it all down. Motive, opportunity, and now intent. Spoken aloud over a photograph of a 9-year-old boy. After they left that night, I sat alone in the dark living room for a long time. I thought about the badge I had carried and the oath that came with it, and how strange it was that the most important case of my life had found me in my own kitchen, served on a plate, poured into my coffee, by people who called me family. I had one piece of physical evidence sealed in a coffee can. I had a notebook full of patterns. What I did not have was proof of what the capsules contained, and I could not get it alone. But I was not entirely alone. In 2 days, my home nurse was scheduled for her routine visit, the same visit she had been making since my heart surgery 3 years back. Her name was Taylor O'Donnell, and in 3 years she had never once lied to me, never once looked at me like a problem to be managed. She was the only person left who saw me as a man instead of an inheritance. I took the coffee can down from the shelf that night and set it by the door, ready. When Taylor arrived, I was going to hand her the first piece of evidence in a case no one knew I had opened. The detective was awake now, and he had no intention of going back to sleep. Taylor O'Donnell arrived on Thursday at 10 in the morning, exactly as she had for 3 years, carrying her blue medical bag and the same unhurried calm that had once gotten me through the worst weeks after my heart surgery. She was somewhere in her early 40s, with steady hands and tired, honest eyes. The eyes of a woman who had sat at too many bedsides to be fooled by a brave face. She took my blood pressure, listened to my heart, and frowned at the readings she had written down on her last few visits. She said my heart rate had been erratic lately, and asked if I had changed anything. Any new medication, anything at all. That was the opening I had been waiting for. I got up, took the coffee can down from the shelf, and set the sealed spice jar on the table between us. I told her everything. Not as a frightened old man, but the way I would have briefed a younger officer. The overheard fragment in the hallway, the bottle Lila had given me, the symptoms that came with the dose and vanished without it, the word dementia, planted carefully over a photograph of my grandson. I watched her face the whole time, because a good interview is really just watching. I needed to know whether she thought I was a man building a case or an old man losing his mind. If even Taylor saw confusion instead of evidence, then I was already finished. She did not look at me like I was confused. She looked at the jar for a long moment, and then she looked at the blood pressure numbers on her chart, and something in her expression closed like a door. She said the readings did fit. Not with age, with a stimulant, or something affecting the nervous system. She said it quietly, like she was afraid of the words. I asked her if she knew a way to find out what was really inside the capsules. Somewhere outside the usual channels. Somewhere that would not put my name on a form my family might one day see. She told me she had a friend from nursing school, Jaime LeBlanc, who worked in a private toxicology lab. She said she could have it tested discreetly, off the record, as a personal favor. I told her that if she did this, she might be pulled into something ugly. I told her she could still walk away and I would never hold it against her. She picked up the jar, slid it into her blue bag, and told me she had spent 20 years watching families turn on their own elders the moment money entered the room. She said she had never once been able to prove it. She said maybe this time she could. Then she left. And I began the hardest part of any investigation. I waited. 4 days passed. I went through the motions of being poisoned. I took the bottle down each morning where Lila might check it. I let Casey hear me sound tired on the phone. I performed my own decline so well that twice I frightened myself. On the 5th day, Taylor called and asked to come by outside her scheduled hours. She sat at my kitchen table without taking off her coat. She set a single folded sheet of paper in front of me, the lab summary. and she put her hand flat on top of it for a moment before she let me see it. The way you brace someone before bad news. The capsule contained almost none of what the label promised. No memory formula, no harmless supplement. What they did contain was a compound that did not belong in any vitamin sold in any store. A substance known to cause confusion, agitation, cardiac irregularity, and in the elderly, symptoms easily mistaken for sudden cognitive decline. It had been mixed in deliberately, in doses calibrated to a man my size. I read the page twice. I had spent 39 years standing over the work of people who hurt others, and I thought I had lost the capacity for shock. I was wrong. For 3 weeks I had told myself a story in which there was still some innocent explanation, some version where my son had simply fallen for the wrong woman. That story died on my kitchen table, under a single sheet of laboratory paper. This was not neglect. It was not greed alone. Someone had measured me, dosed me, and watched me come apart on a schedule, all while smiling across my own dinner table. The bottle in my cabinet was not medicine. It was a weapon. A slow, patient, invisible weapon, aimed at an old man by the people who called him family. I folded the page, looked at Taylor, and felt the last of the grief burn away into something colder and far more useful. I told her the case was no longer about my memory. It was about a crime, and I was going to prove every second of it. The obvious move was to call the police. I knew the number by heart. I had answered that line for most of my adult life, so I sat at the kitchen table that night with the phone in my hand, and I thought it through the way I had thought through 100 arrests. I imagined the call. I imagined the 2 young officers who would come, polite and tired, and I imagined the story they would walk into. An elderly man living alone, with documented heart trouble and recent episodes of confusion. A loving son and his devoted girlfriend, who would arrive within the hour, worried sick. A lab report with no official chain of custody, run as a personal favor, on capsules from a bottle anyone could claim the old man had filled himself. And Lila, calm and tearful and good, so very good, explaining how his memory had been slipping for months, how they had begged him to see a doctor, how heartbreaking it was to watch. I had seen that performance from the other side of the table more times than I could count. I knew exactly who the officers would believe. They would not arrest her. They would gently suggest that I let my family help me. They would write me down as the problem. If I moved too soon, I would not catch a predator. I would hand her the final piece of her own story. So I set the phone down. And I remembered something an old sergeant told me my first year on the job, standing over a case we could not yet prove. He said, "You never arrest a man for the crime you can see. You wait, and you let him commit the one you can prove." Lila had already shown me she was patient. She had spent weeks poisoning me a little at a time. Now I would be patient too. I would let her keep building. I would let her reach for the money, reach for the courts, reach all the way out over the edge. And I would simply make sure the ground was no longer there when she did. But I could not build a case the way I once had, with a badge and a department and a lab behind me. I had a sealed jar, a notebook, a nurse, and a lifetime of instinct. To turn that into something a court could not ignore, I needed a different kind of partner. The next morning I called Bellamy McGuire. Bellamy had been my attorney for over 20 years. He had drawn up my will, managed Megan's estate when she passed, and structured the trust I had built for King. He was a careful, unsentimental man with a gift for reading the fine print other people skimmed. If anyone could turn a father's heartbreak into an airtight legal instrument, it was him. I did not explain it over the phone. I only told him it was urgent, and that it concerned my family, and that I needed to see him in person, alone. There was a pause on the line, And then he said he would clear his afternoon. His office downtown smelled of old paper and strong coffee, and he listened without interrupting for nearly an hour. I laid it out as a report, not a confession. The fragment in the hallway, the bottle, the symptoms charted against the dose, Taylor and the lab, and the compound that did not belong in any vitamin. When I finished, Bellamy took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes for a long moment. He had known Casey since the boy was in middle school. He started to say something gentle, something about how sorry he was. I stopped him. I told him I had not come for sympathy. I'd come for a strategy. I told him I did not want to chase them out into the open where they could scatter and play innocent. I wanted to let them keep moving, keep reaching for the money and the guardianship they thought was already theirs. And I wanted to be waiting at the end of it, with everything documented and legal and impossible to deny. Bellamy was quiet for a moment. Then he put his glasses back on, pulled the fresh legal pad toward him, and asked the first real question of the case. He asked where the money was. He asked whether I was certain it was all still there. It was a simple question, but it landed in my chest like a cold draft through an open door. Because in 3 weeks of fighting for my life, I had never once stopped to check. I told him I did not know. He uncapped his pen and said it was time we found out. 2 days later, I sat beside Bellamy in his office while he pulled up every account I owned on his dual monitors. One after another, the entire architecture of 40 years of work laid out in glowing columns. It is a strange thing, watching your life reduced to numbers on a screen. I did not feel pride. I felt the ghost of every double shift, every holiday I had missed, every birthday Megan had attended alone because I was standing over someone else's tragedy in the cold. Every dollar in those accounts had a memory attached to it, and almost none of the memories were happy. That was the price. I had paid it so that King would never have to. We started with the primary savings account, the foundation of the trust I had built for my grandson. Bellamy had structured it himself years ago, and he knew what the balance should be down to the dollar. He stopped scrolling. He leaned toward the screen, and the easy rhythm of his typing went still. The number was wrong. It was not catastrophically, obviously wrong. That was the first thing I noticed, and the thing that turned my stomach. A thief in a hurry empties an account and runs. This was not that. The balance was lower than it should have been by a careful, deliberate margin. The kind of gap you would never notice unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. Bellamy opened the transaction history, and we read it together in silence. The withdrawals had started months ago, long before the bottle, long before the symptoms. They began small, a few $100s at a time, spaced out, almost shy, the way a person tests a lock to see if anyone is watching. When no alarm sounded, when the confused old man did not call to ask about a missing $500, the amounts grew. By the most recent months, they were no longer shy at all. I sat very still and did the thing I had trained myself to do over a corpse. I stopped feeling, and I started reading. This was the part of the timeline that mattered. The poison had been the second act. This was the first. Before anyone ever decided to dose me into a courtroom, someone had already been quietly bleeding the account I had built for a 9-year-old boy. The theft had not begun as a desperate grab. It had begun as a habit. Bellamy asked me, carefully, whether Casey or Lila had any legitimate access to the account. They did not. I had been deliberate about that. The trust was mine to manage, mine alone, until the day I decided otherwise, which meant every one of those withdrawals was unauthorized. Every one was a crime, layered quietly on top of the crime they were still committing against my body. He ran a filter and pulled the total of the missing funds onto the screen in a single figure. It glowed there in red at the bottom of the column. I had braced myself for a number. I had not braced myself for what it meant. That figure was not just money. It was King's College. It was the safety net I had bled for, so that my grandson would never lie awake at 68, wondering if he had done enough. Someone had been spending it, a little at a time, on a life I had not yet been able to see. Bellamy took off his glasses. He had spent his whole career untangling the greed of families, and even he was quiet for a long moment. He said the obvious thing, the lawyer's thing. He said this changed the case. It was no longer only attempted harm, it was theft, established, ongoing, and provable, with a paper trail no tearful performance could explain away. But I was already past that. I was staring at the red number, and I was thinking about the months before the poison, when I had still believed I was loved. While I had been worrying about my son's happiness had been quietly emptying the account meant for my son's child. I asked Bellamy to print every page of that history, every withdrawal, every date, and to bind it into a single document I could hold in my hands. The money was no longer just stolen. It was the second confirmed chapter of a case I was building to bury them, and I had not even begun to ask the most dangerous question of all. Not where the money had gone, but to whom. Follow the money. It is the oldest rule in any investigation, older than fingerprints, older than motive. People lie with their words and their faces, but money tells the truth. Because money always goes where the heart already is. So that is what we did. Bellamy pulled the routing details on the withdrawals, the merchant names hidden behind the bank codes, and slowly the destinations resolved on the screen, like a photograph coming into focus. The money had not gone to medical bills. It had not gone to some emergency Casey was too proud to mention. It had gone to a life. There were charges at boutiques downtown, the kind with no prices in the window. There were monthly payments to a luxury leasing company for a European car, the same sleek silver car I had seen Lila step out of, the one she said her consulting firm had provided. There were spa weekends, salon appointments, a designer watch, a string of expensive dinners at restaurants I had never been invited to. My grandson's future had been quietly converted, dollar by dollar, into the costume of a wealthy woman. I sat back and felt something I had not expected. Not just anger, recognition. Because the truth was, I had been funding lives I could not see for a very long time. The memories came whether I wanted them or not. The $50,000 I had wired Casey at 25 for a business that folded inside a year. The loan I had quietly forgiven when his second venture collapsed. The credit card debt I had erased without ever telling him I knew. Every time my son had reached the edge of a consequence, I had been there to pour concrete under his feet so he would never feel the fall. I had told myself I was being a good father. Sitting in that office, watching the evidence of his life scroll past, I finally understood what I had actually built. I had spent 30 years teaching my son that failure had no weight, that there would always be a check, always a rescue, always an old man who loved him too much to let him learn. I had not raised a man. I had raised an appetite. And an appetite, once it has eaten everything offered, will eventually reach for what is not. That was the hard truth I had to sit with. Lila had not corrupted some innocent boy. She had simply found a man already trained to take, and shown him how to take more. She was the lit match. But I had spent 3 decades soaking the house in gasoline. Bellamy let me sit with it. He was a decent enough man to know when silence was the kindness. Then he cleared his throat and turned the monitor a few degrees toward me. He said there was something else, something that did not fit. Among the payments, he had found a recurring transfer that did not match any merchant or any lifestyle expense. It went to an account he could not immediately identify, and the name attached to it was not Lila Decker. It was close, the same first name, but the surname was different. older. The kind of small discrepancy that means nothing to a bank and everything to a detective. I leaned toward the screen and read the name twice. In 39 years, I had learned that people are careless with many things, but rarely with their own money. A woman might lie about her past, her job, her heart, but the account where she quietly parks the money she steals, that account tends to wear her real face. Lila Decker had introduced herself to my family with warm eyes and a soft voice and a name. And the money, which never lies, was telling me that the name might not be hers at all. I asked Bellamy to write it down exactly as it appeared. Then I folded the paper and put it in my pocket, next to the lab report and the ledger. The third piece of a case that was no longer about a bottle of pills. I did not yet know who Lila Decker really was, but I knew exactly who could find out. It was time to call an old friend who still carried a badge. Kelvin Keith and I had stood over more dead men together than either of us liked to remember. He'd been my partner for 11 years, and unlike me, he had never quite known when to retire. He still carried a badge, still worked a desk in the department, still answered his phone on the second ring, the way he always had. I met him at a diner on the West Side, the kind of place with bottomless coffee and booths worn soft by decades of tired officers. I slid the folded paper across the table. The name Bellamy had found. The one that was almost Lila Decker, but not quite. I did not tell him everything at first. I told him only that the name belonged to a woman who had attached herself to my son, and that I needed to know who she really was. Kelvin looked at me for a long moment over the rim of his cup. He had known me 30 years. He knew I did not ask questions like that without a body somewhere, even a living one. He said he would run it properly, no favors that could come back on either of us. A legitimate records check, the kind any officer could justify, run through the right channels so that whatever it turned up would still mean something later. It took him 3 days. When he called, he did not want to talk on the phone. He came to my house and sat at my kitchen table with a thin folder he set down like it was heavier than it was. The woman my son had brought into my home was not Lila Decker. That was a name she had worn for about 2 years. One of several. Kelvin laid the pages out across the table, and the real picture assembled itself the way a case file does, piece by ugly piece. Different cities, different names, each one close to the last. A first name kept for convenience, and a surname shed like a coat. And in each city, the same shape to the story. An older man, usually widowed, usually with money and no one watching closely. A warm, attentive woman who arrived in his life through someone he trusted. Health that mysteriously declined. Finances that quietly drained. In 2 of the cases, there had been a guardianship petition. In one, the man had died before it was resolved, and the death had been ruled natural, and no one had ever looked again. I read that page twice. Natural causes. I knew exactly how a death gets ruled natural when an old man's heart simply stops, and everyone around him wears the right expression of grief. She had done this before, more than once, and she had never been caught, because she chose her victims precisely the way I would have. Men whose own families were too distant or too greedy to ask questions. Men whose confusion would surprise no one. Kelvin pointed to one more thing. A name that recurred across the cases, faint but consistent. A man named Armando Velez, who surfaced at the edges, handling accounts, notarizing documents. The kind of quiet partner who never appears in the front of the photograph, but is always somewhere in the room. Lila was the face. Velez, it seemed, was the machinery. I sat back in my chair and let it settle over me, cold and clarifying. My son had not made a foolish mistake. My son had not been seduced by a gold digger who got greedy. My son had brought a professional into my home. A woman who hunted men exactly like me for a living. and who had buried at least one of them under a clean certificate and a sympathetic frown. Some part of me, the father, wanted to be horrified, but the detective in me felt something almost like relief. Because a professional is predictable. A professional has a method, and a method has a pattern, and a pattern can be anticipated. An amateur panics. A professional follows the playbook. And now I had read her playbook, Kelvin me, quietly, what I intended to do. He offered to open a case right then. I told him no, not yet. If we moved now, she would vanish and surface in some other city under some other name, and another widower would smile at her across his own kitchen table. I did not want her to run. I wanted her to finish. I told Kelvin I needed him for one thing only, when the time came. To be in a particular room, on a particular day, holding that folder. Then I had to go home and study the playbook of the woman who intended to make my death look natural. For days I had managed to keep Casey in a separate file in my mind. Lila was the predator. Lila was the professional, the one with the playbook and the buried bodies. And Casey, I told myself, was just another of her victims. A weak man led by the hand into something far darker than he could understand. It was a comforting theory. I clung to it the way I had clung to that bottle of pills, swallowing it each morning because the alternative was simply unbearable. A man can survive being betrayed by a stranger. It is a different thing entirely to be betrayed by the child you held in the delivery room. But I had been a detective long before I was ever a father. And a detective does not get to choose which evidence he is willing to look at. The case does not care what you can bear. It only cares what is true. So one quiet afternoon, with the house empty and the rain coming down gray and steady against the windows, I made myself open the file on my own son. I started where I always started, with who he had been. I remembered Casey at 6 years old, asleep against my shoulder on the train home from a Cubs game, his small hand wrapped around my thumb as if it were the only safe thing in the world. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle on Kedzie Avenue, running behind him with my hand on the back of the seat, letting go a full second before he ever knew I had. I remembered the boy who wept at his mother's funeral so hard that he could not stand on his own, and how I had held him up, 12 years old and shaking in a suit a size too big, and whispered to him that he would never be alone as long as I drew breath. I had kept that promise. That was the bitter joke buried at the center of all of it. I had never once let him be alone. I had never once let him stand without my hand somewhere on the seat. And somewhere in all those years of catching him before he could fall, the boy who had cried for his mother had quietly grown into a man who could sit at my dinner table and watch me being poisoned and reach for the salt. But a memory is not evidence. Grief is not proof. I needed to know, with the same cold certainty I had once demanded of every case I ever closed, exactly how deep my son was buried in this. So I looked. Bellamy had pulled the full stack of paperwork connected to the accounts, the authorizations and the filings, and somewhere in that pile, I suspected, my son had left his own fingerprints. A man like Casey does not design a scheme like this. He does not have the patience or the nerve. But a scheme like this needs a cooperating relative now and then. It needs a name on a line, a signature from someone with blood ties, to dress the theft up as a family taking care of its own. It did not take me long to find it. There, on a document authorizing a change to the management of the trust. Drafted quietly months ago in the careful, lawyerly language that Lila and her silent partner would have prepared, was my son's signature. Not forged, not traced by some stranger's hand. His own. The same small loop on the capital C that I had watched him practice at this very kitchen table when he was 8 years old. His tongue poking out in concentration as he learned to write his own name. He had signed it. He had either read what they put in front of him, or chosen not to read it, which is its own kind of decision. And then he had picked up a pen and put his name to the slow, deliberate erasure of his own father. I sat with that signature for a long time. Longer than I had sat with the lab report. Longer than I had stared at the red number in Bellamy's office. Longer than I had studied the folder Kelvin laid across this same table. Because this was the wound that none of the others had been able to reach. The poison had told me only that a stranger wanted me gone. The stolen money had told me only that a stranger was greedy. But the signature told me that the boy I had chased down Kedzie Avenue, the boy I had held upright at his mother's grave, had looked at a piece of paper that ended me and had agreed. There would be no version of this story in which I saved him. I understood that fully now, the way you finally accept a death you have spent weeks refusing to believe. The son I had been so desperate to rescue from Lila had stopped existing somewhere I had not been watching closely enough. The thing sitting at my table now wore his face and carried his name and shared absolutely none of his heart. I closed the file. I did not weep. The part of me that might have wept for Casey had been signing its own quiet documents for years, and the hard truth was that I had simply never bothered to read those either. I had wanted more than catching Lila, more than recovering a single stolen dollar, to find just one page in this entire case that told me my son was innocent. Instead, I had found his name, written in his own careful hand, on the very page that proved he was not. So I stopped looking for the boy, and I began, at last, to build the case against the man. A case is not a pile of evidence. That is the mistake amateurs make. They gather a drawer full of damning facts and assume the facts will speak for themselves. They never do. Facts are mute until someone arranges them into a story a judge cannot unhear. What I had now was a drawer full of facts. What I needed was the architecture to hold them. So Bellamy and I began to build. We laid everything out on the long table in his office, the way I had once laid out a homicide board. The sealed jar of capsules, the lab report from Jaime LeBlanc, with the compound named and the dosage estimated. Taylor's clinical notes, 3 years of steady readings with a sudden, inexplicable break in the rhythm of my own heart. The ledger of stolen money, the recurring transfer to an account that did not wear Lila's borrowed name. The thin folder Kelvin had brought, with its other cities and its other men, and its one clean death certificate. And, at the center of it all, my son's signature. Bellamy walked the length of the table slowly, the way a builder walks a foundation before he trusts it. Then he stopped and told me the truth I already suspected. He said it was strong. Stronger than most cases that put people away. But strong was not the same as finished, and there was a hole in it. The hole was Lila's own words. Everything we had proved what was done. None of it proved, in her voice, that she had meant to do it. We could show the poison and the theft and the pattern, and a good defense attorney would stand up and grieve theatrically about a lonely old man, a misunderstanding, a girlfriend who had only ever tried to help. We had the body of the crime. We did not yet have the confession. I knew how to get a confession. I had drawn hundreds of them out of people across a steel table, but I was not a detective with a badge anymore, and Illinois is not a forgiving state when it comes to recording another person without their knowledge. Here, the law requires that all parties consent to a private recording. A tape I made in secret would not be a weapon. It would be a crime of my own, and worse, it would be inadmissible. The one card a defense lawyer needs to make a jury distrust everything else. Bellamy was firm about it. He said if I tried to be clever, if I hid a recorder in my own living room and caught her admitting everything, I would hand the entire case back to her. The evidence would be thrown out, and I would be the old man who illegally taped his loving family. He had seen it happen. He would not let it happen to me. There was a lawful path, though, and it was narrower and far more patient. Some settings carry no expectation of privacy. Some conversations happen on a record by their very nature. A formal proceeding, with a court reporter present, with everyone sworn and everyone speaking for the transcript. That was a place where words could be captured cleanly and used. A hearing. A guardianship hearing. Exactly the kind Lila was already steering me toward. That was the moment the whole shape of it turned over in my mind, and I understood what we were really going to do. They were building a courtroom to bury me in. They were assembling doctors and documents and a tearful narrative, all to stand before a judge and declare that Ameer Alexander could no longer be trusted with his own life. They were going to all that trouble to put me in a room, under oath, in front of an official record. I was simply going to let them. And when they had finished building that room, when they had paid for the court reporter and filed the petition and gathered their lies into one place at one time, I was going to walk in and turn their courtroom into the place where their own words convicted them. I told Bellamy to stop trying to stop the guardianship hearing. I wanted it to proceed. I wanted them confident, prepared, and on the record. He looked at me for a long moment over his glasses. Then, slowly, he smiled. The first time he had smiled since I walked into his office with this nightmare. He said in 20 years he had never heard a client ask him to help the other side build their own trap. I told him it was the oldest trick I knew. You never stop a man who is busy digging. You hand him a bigger shovel, and you make sure the hole is exactly the right shape. We worked until the sky went dark outside the office windows. We organized the evidence into the order I would reveal it, layer by layer, each one cutting off a retreat. The poison first, to establish intent to harm. The money second, to establish motive. And the folder last, Kelvin's folder, to establish that this was not a family tragedy at all, but the calculated work of a professional who had done it before. 3 layers, 3 doors, each one closing behind her. Bellamy gathered the pages and squared them against the table. He asked me if I was ready to spend the next weeks pretending to be exactly the broken man they needed me to be. I told him I had been pretending for 3 weeks already. The only difference now was that I knew the ending. Knowing the ending is not the same as reaching it. Between the plan and the payoff lies the most dangerous stretch of any operation. The part where everyone has to hold their nerve and play their assigned role. And where a single careless move can collapse weeks of patient work. I had run enough operations to know that the plan is the easy part. The discipline to wait inside it is what separates the men who close cases from the men who only dream about it. So before anything else, I assembled my people. I could not do this alone, and I had stopped pretending otherwise. A lone old man making accusations was exactly the picture Lila needed the world to see. But an old man with a nurse, a lawyer, and a serving detective standing behind him was something else entirely. He was no longer a confused victim. He was a case with witnesses. I brought the 3 of them together one evening, away from my house, in the back room of Bellamy's office where no one would think to look for us. Taylor came straight from a shift, still in her scrubs. Kelvin came in his civilian coat with the folder under his arm. Bellamy laid out coffee and legal pads as though it were any other meeting. And in a sense it was. We were simply assigning roles in a production that had to run without a single missed cue. Taylor's role was the medicine. When the moment came, she would testify to what she had seen with her own eyes, the readings, the decline that arrived with the dose and vanished without it, the chain of custody on the jar she had carried to the lab herself. She was the one witness Lila could not paint as bitter or greedy, a professional with nothing to gain and a license to lose. Kelvin's role was the past. He would not say a word until the end. He would simply be present, in uniform, holding the folder. And when Bellamy called for it, he would open the door on Lila's history, in front of the one audience she could never charm. A judge with a court reporter, taking down every syllable. Bellamy's role was the structure. He would conduct it all, layer by layer, in the order we had set, never rushing, never reaching for the next door until the last one had closed. And my role, the hardest of all, was to be weak. That was the part that turned my stomach. And I made myself sit with it until it stopped. For the trap to work, Lila had to believe, right up until the final morning, that the poison was working. She had to walk into that hearing utterly confident, carrying her tearful story and her cooperative son and her bought doctors, certain that the man across the room was already half erased. Confidence makes people careless. A predator who believes the hunt is over stops watching the tree line. I needed her to stop watching, so I would keep taking the bottle down where she might check it. I would keep letting Casey hear me sound lost and tired on the telephone. When she visited, I would let a pause sit a beat too long, let a name slip just out of reach, let my hand tremble around a coffee cup. I would give her, every single day, the small, steady performance of a man coming apart, and I would let her think she was the author of it. Kelvin did not like it. He said it plainly, the way only an old partner can. He said I was letting her keep her hands on me, letting her go on believing she could still reach for the kill, and that there was risk in that, real risk, to a man with a heart that had already been through one surgery. He asked me what would happen if she decided not to wait for the courtroom, if she grew impatient and increased the dose. It was a fair question, and I had already answered it for myself. I told him I was no longer taking a single capsule, that the bottle in my cabinet was theater and nothing more. Whatever she thought was coursing through my blood was only my own performance now. The poison had stopped weeks ago. The only thing still declining in that house was an act. Taylor added one condition of her own. She would keep coming on schedule, every visit, and she would check me herself each time, quietly, so that if anything changed in my body, we would know before they did. I agreed. It was a good condition. It was the kind of thing a real team thinks of, the small safety net under the high wire. We went over the sequence twice more, until each of us could have recited the other's parts. The medicine, the money, the past, the poison, the theft, the professional. 3 layers, 3 doors, and a predator walking willingly into the only room where her own confidence could not save her. When they had gone, I stood alone in Bellamy's darkened office and felt the strange calm I used to feel the night before a long-planned arrest. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Now there was only the waiting, and the acting, and the slow work of letting them believe they had already won. The next morning, I would begin to disappear on purpose. I would become, day by day, exactly the broken man they were counting on, and I would let them schedule the hearing that would end them. The hardest role I ever played, I played in my own living room, for an audience of 2 who believed they were watching a man die. It began the very next visit. Lila arrived with Casey on a Sunday afternoon, carrying a paper bag of groceries she did not need to bring, and a smile she had clearly practiced in the car. I met them at the door, and before I said a word, I let my eyes drift past her shoulder for a half-second too long, as if I were searching the empty hallway for someone who was not there. I watched her notice it. I watched her file it away. A lifetime of interrogations had taught me how to read the small tells people give without knowing. Now I had to give them on purpose, which is a far more difficult craft. A real symptom is effortless. A performed one has to be invisible, buried inside ordinary motion, never reaching for the camera. So I did not act confused. I let confusion happen to me in small, quiet ways, and let them be the ones to notice. I called Casey by the name of his cousin once, and then corrected myself a beat too slowly. I set my coffee down and forgot I had poured it and let it go cold on the table while Lila watched it cool. When she asked what I had done that week, I told her about a trip to the hardware store that I let trail off in the middle, as though the end of the sentence had simply walked out of the room without me. Each time I watched it land, and each time, Lila's performance and mine met somewhere in the air between us. Two actors in the same scene, each certain they were the only one who knew it was a play. She was good, I will give her that, the way one professional grudgingly credits another. She had a gift for warmth that never once slipped, a way of resting her hand on my arm and lowering her voice to the register people use for the very old and the very sick. She would glance at Casey with theatrical worry, as if her heart were breaking, and Casey, my son, would look at the floor and nod along, too cowardly even to meet the eyes of the father he was helping to erase. That nodding was the hardest thing to sit through. Worse than her hand on my arm, worse than the cold coffee. Watching my own son agree, silently, over and over, to the slow lie they were building around me. But the performance was working, and a working trap is a beautiful, terrible thing. The more helpless I appeared, the bolder Lila became, and the bolder she became, the more she let slip. People relax around what they believe is already finished. Over those weeks, she stopped guarding her words the way she once had. One afternoon, stacking my mail on the counter, she mentioned offhandedly that she had taken the liberty of speaking with a doctor who specialized in cognitive evaluations, a man who, she said, understood these difficult family situations and could move quickly. She said it lightly, the way you mention a dinner reservation. I nodded vaguely and asked if he was nice, and she smiled and said he was very understanding. I understood exactly what understanding meant. It meant bought. Another time she let drop that it would be easier on everyone. Kinder, really, if certain decisions were made before things got worse, while I could still be guided gently rather than forced. She used that word, guided, as if I were a car drifting toward a ditch and she were merely a hand on the wheel. I let my eyes water a little and told her I trusted them to do what was best. She squeezed my hand. Behind her, Casey looked away. Every word went into the notebook the moment they left. Not as evidence, none of it could be used, but as a map. She was telling me, without knowing it, exactly how she intended to walk into that courtroom, which meant she was telling me exactly where to be standing when she did. Then, on a gray evening near the end of it, she arrived without groceries and without the long, warm preamble. She sat across from me, took both my hands in hers, and told me, in the gentlest voice she owned, that the family had found a wonderful place where I could be properly cared for, and that there would be a hearing soon, just a formality, to make everything official and legal so that no one could ever take advantage of me. No one could ever take advantage of me. She said it with her wet eyes fixed on mine, and I had to summon every year of discipline I owned not to laugh, or weep, or reach across the table and tell her the truth. She gave me the date. She said it as though she were doing me a kindness. I thanked her. I told her she had been so good to me, and inside, behind the trembling old man she thought she had built, the detective wrote the date down in ink that would never wash out. The trap was no longer something I was setting. It was setting itself now, and she was the one holding the date in her hand. They drove me out to see the place on a flat, colorless morning, the kind of sky that does not commit to rain. Lila sat in the back seat beside me, her hand resting on mine the entire way, and Casey drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road as though it required all his concentration not to look at me in the mirror. The facility sat at the end of a long service road past the county highway, a low brick building the color of old bandages, surrounded by a lawn that was green in the way only chemicals can make a lawn green. There was a sign out front with a soft, reassuring name, the kind of name that is chosen specifically so that families can say it without flinching. A managed care residence, a community, everything but what it was, which was a place you put a person when you have decided they are finished. A woman named Elise Trevino met us at the door with a clipboard and the practiced warmth of someone who gives the same tour several times a week. She shook my hand too gently, the way people do when they have already been told a man is fragile. She had been told. I could see it in the way she looked at me, and in the way she looked at Lila, with the quiet understanding of one professional acknowledging another. Whatever story Lila had brought ahead of me, it had arrived and been believed. They walked me down a corridor that smelled of disinfectant laid over something it could not quite cover. The lights were the flat fluorescent kind that make everyone look already ill. Through open doors, I saw small rooms with single beds and televisions bolted to the walls. And in the chairs by the windows, old men and women sat looking out at that chemical lawn, waiting for something that was not coming. I made myself look at them. I made myself memorize the room they intended for me, the narrow bed, the view of the parking lot, the call button I would press for the rest of whatever life they planned to allow me. And for one moment, standing in that doorway, the performance nearly broke. Not from fear, from rage. A clean, white-hot rage at the thought that this was the ending they had chosen for the man who had carried Casey on his shoulders down Kedzie Avenue. I felt it rise into my throat, and I swallowed it. I let my face stay slack and uncertain. I had spent 39 years keeping my expression still over things far worse than a tidy room, and I kept it still now. The rage was useful. I folded it up and put it away where I kept the rest of my evidence, and I let them lead me back toward the office. That was where the real purpose of the visit revealed itself. Elise set a small stack of papers on the desk and slid them toward me with a pen. Intake forms, she called them. Just preliminary, nothing binding, simply to get me into the system so there would be no delays later. Lila leaned in close and told me softly that signing now would make everything so much smoother, that I would not want to be filling out paperwork when I was tired and upset on moving day. Moving day. She had a name for it already. I picked up the pen. And here is where my own small piece of patience paid off, the seed I had planted weeks earlier with Bellamy in his office. I did not sign my name the way I had signed it for 68 years. Bellamy and I had filed a document with the proper authorities, quietly, establishing a deliberate variation in my signature, a legally recognized distress marker. To Lila, watching with hungry eyes, it would look like nothing more than the shaky, broken scrawl of a declining man. The letters came out jagged and disconnected. I added a small, wrong flourish at the end, and I misspelled my own middle name by a single letter. An error a confused old man might make. To her, it was proof of my decline. To a judge who knew what to look for, it would be a flare fired into the dark. A signal that the hand which signed this page was signing under duress and manipulation. I slid the papers back. Elise smiled and gathered them. Lila squeezed my shoulder and told me I had done so well. Casey, by the window, finally looked at me, and for half a second, something moved behind his eyes. Something that might once have been shame. Then he looked away. On the drive home, Lila talked brightly about how nice the staff had been, how I would make friends, how this was the best thing for everyone. I watched the gray fields slide past the window and said nothing. An old man being delivered, in their minds, to his own quiet end. In my mind, I had just signed the first piece of evidence they would use to convict themselves. They thought they were measuring me for a bed. I just measured them for a cell. The night before the hearing, they came to celebrate, though they would never have used that word. Lila called it a quiet family dinner, a chance to be together before the difficult day ahead. She arrived early and took over my kitchen, the kitchen where Megan had cooked 30 Thanksgivings, and she filled it with the smells of a meal she wanted me to remember as kindness. A roast, bread warming in the oven, a pie cooling on the counter that she had baked herself. She made sure to tell me, just for me. She moved through that room as though she already owned it, opening the right drawers without asking, and in her mind, I suppose, she very nearly did. I sat at the head of the table and let her serve me. I had decided that this last performance would be my finest, because it was the last one she would ever see, and because everything depended on her walking into that courtroom in the morning without a single doubt in her heart. So I gave her certainty. It was the most valuable gift I had, and the most dangerous one I could hand her. I let my hand shake as I lifted my fork. I thanked her 3 times for the same dish, as though I had forgotten thanking her the first 2. When Casey poured the wine, expensive wine, I noted, bought with money that had once been meant for his own son, I raised my glass and made a small, fumbling toast to family, and let my voice catch, as though the word moved me. Lila pressed her hand to her chest. Casey looked into his glass. They relaxed by degrees over that meal, the way people do when they believe the hard part is behind them. Lila began to talk about the future, as if I were not in the room, or as if I were already a ghost at my own table. She talked about how peaceful the facility would be for me, how I would be looked after, how she and Casey could finally settle into something stable now that the worry of my care was being handled. She used that phrase, the worry of my care being handled, as though I were a leak in a roof, and tomorrow was the day the repair was finally scheduled. I listened to every word. A lifetime of sitting across tables from people who believed they had gotten away with something had taught me that the moment of triumph is the moment of greatest carelessness. People confess in celebration far more than they ever do under pressure. So I kept my face soft and let them feel safe, and they gave me, freely, the full shape of their confidence. Casey grew talkative for the first time in weeks, loosened by the wine and the nearness of the finish line. He spoke about plans, vague, wealthy plans, a better place to live, a fresh start, the kind of future a man imagines when he believes a large sum of money is about to land in his lap. Not once did he look at the chair where his mother used to sit. Not once did he seem to feel the weight of the house around him, the photographs on the mantel, the boy he had been within these walls. I looked at my son across that table, in the warm light, eating a fine meal in the home I had built. The night before, he would stand in a courtroom and swear his father was no longer fit to live as a free man. And I felt the last thread of something finally go slack inside me. Not snap, slacken, quietly. The way a rope goes loose when the weight on the other end is finally gone. When the pie was served, Lila cut me the largest slice and set it before me like an offering. She told me everything was going to be all right now. She told me they would take care of everything. She believed she was comforting a frightened old man on the eve of his surrender. I took a slow bite, and I thanked her. And I told her I did not know what I would do without them. It was the truest false thing I said all night. They left late, full and warm and certain. At the door, Lila embraced me, and I felt how relaxed she was in that embrace. A hunter who has already mounted the head on the wall and is only going through the formalities. Casey clasped my shoulder, and, for just a moment, held on a half-second too long. And I will never know if that was guilt or only the wine. Then they were gone, their car lights sweeping across the ceiling and out. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen among the dirty plates and the cooling pie. They had spent the evening measuring me for a hospital bed, comforting the corpse before the burial. In the morning, they would walk into a room they thought was a coronation. I knew it was a courtroom. The hearing was held in a small courtroom on the 3rd floor of the county building. A plain room with no grandeur to it. Only a wooden bench, a few rows of seats, an American flag gone slightly gray with age, and a court reporter setting up her machine in the corner. It was not the kind of room where you imagine a life being decided. But that is exactly where lives are decided. In plain rooms by tired people over stacks of ordinary paper. I arrived early, leaning on a cane I did not need, with Bellamy at my side carrying a briefcase that looked far too modest for what it held. I let myself be guided to my seat like a man unsure of his own feet. Across the aisle, Lila and Casey were already settled, and the sight of them nearly undid the calm I had spent weeks building. Lila had dressed for the part of the grieving, devoted family member with the precision of a costume designer. A soft gray dress, no jewelry that might look like wealth, a tissue already clutched in one hand, though her eyes were perfectly dry. Casey sat beside her in a pressed shirt, pale and tight around the jaw, a man performing sorrow he was too frightened to actually feel. They had a lawyer of their own, a smooth, expensive man who shuffled his papers with the confidence of someone who had never once expected to lose. The judge entered, and we rose. And I rose slowly, with help. Her name was Audrey Herring, and she had the weary, watchful face of a woman who had presided over 1,000 of these petitions, and had learned to distrust easy tears. That was good. I'd been counting on a judge who watched. Their lawyer went first, because the burden was theirs, and he built his case exactly as I had known he would. He spoke of a beloved father and grandfather in tragic decline. He spoke of episodes of confusion, of a man found wandering his own home at night, of a frightening inability to manage his affairs. He produced an evaluation from a cooperative doctor, the understanding one Lila had mentioned, full of soft, clinical language that gestured at dementia without quite committing to it. He produced the intake forms from the facility, and he held up the page bearing my jagged, broken signature as proof of how far I had fallen. He did not know what that signature really was. He waved my own flare in the air and called it weakness. Lila took the stand and wept on cue. She described, in a trembling voice, the heartbreak of watching me deteriorate, the sleepless nights of worry, the impossible decision they had been forced to make out of love. She was extraordinary. If I had not known the truth, if I had not held the lab report and the ledger in the folder, I might have believed her myself. Judge Herring watched her without expression and made a note. Casey was not called to speak, and I understood why. He could not have held it together. He sat with his hands clenched in his lap, staring at a fixed point on the floor. And not once, in that entire morning, did he turn his head to look at the father he was helping to bury. Through all of it, I played my part. I sat hunched and uncertain. When their lawyer glanced my way to gesture at my decline, I let my hands tremble in my lap, and my eyes drift to the window. The very picture of a man who did not fully understand the proceeding deciding the rest of his life. I gave them, one last time, the broken old man they had paid for in capsules and lies. And then the judge turned to our side of the room. She looked at Bellamy, and she looked at me, and she asked whether the respondent wished to say anything on his own behalf before she considered the petition. This was the hinge, the single moment the entire operation had been built around. Across the aisle, Lila allowed herself the smallest, most human thing she did all morning, a flicker of a smile. because she believed there was nothing left to fear, that the broken man would mumble something confused and seal his own fate. I put my hands on the table. I had spent 3 weeks teaching them to see a man who could barely stand. I stood. Not slowly, not with help. I stood the way I had stood for 39 years, walking into rooms full of people who had done terrible things, straight-backed and certain. And I left the cane hanging on the chair where it belonged. I looked across the aisle and let them see, for the first time, the man who had been watching them the entire time. I watched the flicker of Lila's smile freeze and begin, slowly, to die. For 3 weeks I had shown them a victim. Now, in a plain room with a reporter taking down every word, I let them meet the detective. I did not raise my voice. In 39 years I had learned that the quietest voice in a room is the one everyone leans in to hear. I told the court that I was not confused. I told them I knew exactly what day it was, exactly where I was, and exactly why every person in that room had come. Then I told Judge Herring that before she ruled on whether I could be trusted with my own life, she might want to see the evidence the petitioners had neglected to bring. Bellamy opened the briefcase. He began with the medicine, because intent to harm comes before everything. He laid the sealed jar on the table first, then the laboratory report beside it, and he explained, in plain language, what the capsules in that jar actually contained. Not a memory supplement, not a vitamin. A compound that caused exactly the confusion, the agitation, the racing heart, the lost hours that the petitioners had just spent an hour describing as natural decline. He read the name of the compound into the record. He read the estimated dose, calibrated. The lab had noted, to a man of my weight. Across the aisle, Lila's lawyer rose to object, to call it unverified, to call it the fantasy of a paranoid old man. And that was when Bellamy called Taylor O'Donnell. Taylor took the stand in her scrubs, having come straight from a shift, and she was everything Lila was not. Calm, unrehearsed, with nothing to gain and a license to lose. She described 3 years of steady readings and the sudden, inexplicable break in the rhythm of a heart she knew well. She described the chain of custody on the jar, sealed and dated, carried by her own hand to the lab. She described how the symptoms had vanished the moment the dosing stopped. She did not weep. She did not perform. She simply told the truth. And the truth, spoken plainly by an honest witness, filled that plain room until there was no air left for the lie. I watched Judge Herring set down her pen. She was no longer making notes. She was listening with her whole body now, the way people listen when a story they had accepted begins to come apart in front of them. Lila shifted in her seat. The tissue was gone from her hand. The trembling devotion had drained out of her face, and something harder was surfacing in its place. The face beneath the face, the one I had glimpsed in my hallway weeks ago. Then Bellamy moved to the second layer, the money. He laid out the ledger, the months of withdrawals from the trust I had built for my grandson, beginning long before any symptom, small and shy at first, then bolder. He showed where the money had gone, the leased car, the boutiques, the life of manufactured wealth. He established that neither petitioner had any lawful access to that account, which made every withdrawal a theft, documented and dated, and impossible to weep away. And then he reached the document that mattered most. The authorization, drafted months ago, that had quietly handed control toward the very people now claiming to act out of love. He set it before the judge, and he pointed to the signature at the bottom. Not mine. My son's. The room went very still. Their own lawyer stopped shuffling his papers. Lila turned her head, slowly, and looked at Casey. And it was not a look of love. It was the look of an architect watching a load-bearing wall begin to fail. Casey came apart in stages, the way buildings do. First his shoulders, then his hands, which began to shake against his knees. Then his face, crumpling as the weight of his own name, written in his own hand, sat on the table in front of a judge for everyone to see. The doctor's report had described a confused old man. The ledger described a thief. But that signature described a son who had read what they put in front of him and signed away his father anyway. Judge Herring looked at that signature for a long moment. Then she looked at Casey, and she asked him a single question. She asked if that was his signature. He could have lied. A stronger man, or a worse one, might have. But Casey had never been strong, and the truth had finally caught up to a man who had spent his whole life outrunning consequences with his father's money. He opened his mouth, and what came out was barely a word. He said yes, one syllable, into the record, in front of the court reporter taking down every sound. With that single word, my son confirmed, under oath, that he had known, that he had participated, that the loving family in tragic crisis was something else entirely. I felt no triumph. I want to be honest about that. I had imagined this moment for weeks, and I had expected it to taste like victory. It tasted like nothing at all. It tasted like a door closing in a house I would never enter again. 2 layers were down, the poison and the money, the intent and the motive. But there was one door left, and it was the heaviest of them all, and it would not open with paper. It would open with a man who still carried a badge. Bellamy turned toward the back of the courtroom and asked the court's permission to call one final witness. Then the door opened, and Kelvin Keith walked in. He came in uniform, which he had not worn to a courtroom in years, and he carried the thin folder under his arm the way he had carried it into my kitchen weeks before. He did not look at Lila as he passed her. He did not need to. The sight of a man in a police uniform walking the length of that small room toward the stand did more to her composure than any document Bellamy had laid down. I watched her track him across the room, and I watched the last of her performance fall away entirely. Because Lila, of all people, knew exactly what it meant when the past walks into the room wearing a badge. Kelvin took the stand and was sworn. Bellamy asked him to describe what a routine records check had revealed about the woman seated across the aisle, the woman who had introduced herself to my family as Lila Decker. He opened the folder. The name on the petition, he said, was one of several. He laid out the others, city by city, each one close to the last. A first name kept, and a surname shed like a coat between towns. And in each city, he said, the same shape repeated itself. An older man, usually widowed, usually with money and no one watching closely. A warm woman who arrived through someone he trusted. Health that declined without explanation. Accounts that quietly emptied. 2 prior guardianship petitions in other counties, and in one case, he said, his voice flat and clear for the record, the man had died before anything could be resolved, and the death had been ruled natural, and no one had ever looked again. The room had been quiet before. Now it was the silence of held breath. He named the recurring partner, a man called Armando Velez, who surfaced at the edges of each case, handling accounts, notarizing the documents that moved an old man's money, never in the front of the picture, but always somewhere in the room. Kelvin noted, for the record, that Velez's name appeared on the very authorization already entered into evidence, the one bearing my son's signature. The professional who had built the paperwork, and the son who had signed it, joined now on the same page. Judge Herring set down everything in her hands. She looked at the woman who had wept so beautifully an hour earlier, and when she spoke, her voice had changed entirely. The petition for guardianship, she said, was denied. And then she did the thing I had built this entire room to make her do. She instructed the bailiff to detain both petitioners, and she directed that the entire record, the lab report, the ledger, the testimony, the folder, be referred immediately to the state's attorney and to the police for criminal investigation. It happened quickly after that, the way these things do once the structure finally gives. An officer stepped forward. Lila rose, and for one moment I thought she might run, the way her kind always wants to run. But there was nowhere left to go. The room she had built to bury me had become exactly as I intended, the room that closed around her. She turned and looked at me then, fully, for the first time without a mask. There was no warmth in it, and no fear either. Only the cold professional recognition of a hunter who has finally met the one animal she should not have chosen. I held her gaze. I did not gloat. I simply let her see that the confused old man had never existed, that she had been watched and measured from the very first night she set that bottle on my table. The handcuffs closed with a sound I had heard 10,000 times in my life, and never once grown tired of. The small, final click of a case coming to its end. For 39 years I had closed other people's cases. Murders, frauds, the long, quiet cruelties that families inflict on their own. I had stood in countless rooms and felt that click and known that, for one victim somewhere, the world had been set a degree closer to right. I had never expected the last case of my life to be my own. I had never expected to build the file at my own kitchen table, with poison in my coffee and my son's name on the evidence. But the work was the same. You do not strike the rotten beam with a hammer. You document the failure. You let the weight gather, and you stand clear when it finally comes down. It came down now. All of it. The poison, the theft, the borrowed names, the buried man in another city who would, perhaps, finally be looked at again because of what happened in this plain, grey room. I stood among the falling pieces of it and felt the thing I had been chasing for weeks settle quietly into place. The cold case at home was finally closed. A structure does not fall all at once. First one support gives, and then the load it was carrying shifts onto the next, and the next, until the whole thing comes down in a sequence so fast it looks like a single event. I had seen it in buildings. That afternoon, in the hallway outside that courtroom, I saw it in a marriage. They were brought out one after the other, and the alliance that had poisoned me did not survive its first contact with consequence. It came apart right there on the gray tile floor in front of the bailiff, in front of the few strangers waiting for their own hearings. Lila turned on Casey before they had walked 10 feet. The soft, grieving voice she had used in the courtroom was gone completely, burned away to reveal the flat, fast, calculating tone I had first heard through my own kitchen door. She called him useless. She told him that a competent man could have kept his own father in line, that she had done all the difficult work while he sat there sweating and staring at the floor, that his weakness in there, his single whispered yes, had cost them everything. Every cruel thing she had been hiding behind that warm smile came pouring out at once, and it was all aimed at the man she had supposedly loved. Casey did not fight back. He never had. He simply absorbed it, the way he had absorbed every hard thing in his life, by going smaller and quieter and waiting for someone to fix it. But there was no one left to fix it. I had spent 30 years being the one who fixed it, and I was standing very still against the far wall, doing nothing at all. Then Casey found a target he dared to push against, and of course it was her. He turned on Lila and shouted that this had been her idea, all of it, the pills, the doctor, the accounts. He shouted that she had ruined his life, that he had never wanted any of it, that she had made him do it. It was a lie, and a coward's lie at that. The lie of a man who had signed his name with his own hand, and now wanted to claim the pen had moved itself. But it did not matter who was telling the truth. They were both going down the same hole, and they had stopped being partners the instant the floor opened beneath them. I learned later that the collapse spread further than that hallway. Armando Velez, the quiet man who had built the paperwork and notarized the theft, had counted on staying in the background where he had always survived. But his name was on the document now, entered into a court record, tied to a son's confession and a folder full of other cities. There is no background once a case becomes official. The machinery he had operated for so long simply turned and began to grind toward him, too. He had trusted that Lila would keep their work invisible. Her greed had dragged him into the light along with everyone else she touched. That is the thing about a scheme built on taking. It only holds together while everyone is still winning. The moment the money vanishes, so does the loyalty. Because there was never any loyalty in the first place. Only a shared appetite wearing the costume of love. I watched my son and the woman who had tried to kill me tear at each other on a courthouse floor, and I felt no satisfaction in it. I had expected to. For weeks, in the cold hours of planning, I had imagined this exact picture and assumed it would feel like justice. It did not feel like justice. It felt like watching a house I had once lived in burn down with all the windows lit. Then it was nearly over. An officer moved to take Lila on, and she went without another word, her spine straight, already calculating her next performance for whoever would listen next. She did not look back at me again. I had stopped being prey, and to a woman like her, that meant I had stopped existing. But Casey did look back. As they began to lead him away, he twisted around and saw me there against the wall, and something broke in his face that was older than this courtroom, older than Lila, older than all of it. He pulled against the officer's grip, not to escape, but to reach me. He called out the word he had not been able to say in 3 weeks of sitting at my table. He called me Dad. He said it the way he used to say it as a boy when he had broken something and come running home, certain that whatever it was, I could make it right. Dad. And then he was on his knees on that gray tile, hands reaching toward me, begging me to help him, begging me to make a call, to hire a lawyer, to do the thing I had always done, to fix it. The whole hallway turned to watch an old man stand silent while his son knelt and wept at his feet. I looked down at him, and I understood that the hardest part of the entire case was not the poison, or the courtroom, or the click of the cuffs. It was this. It was the choice I now had to make, in front of everyone, about the boy I had carried down Kedzie Avenue. I knelt down, not to embrace him. I knelt because I did not want the last conversation I would ever have with my son to be one where I towered over him while he wept on the floor. Even now, even after everything, I would not give him that to remember. I lowered myself to his level, the way I had once lowered myself to teach him to tie his shoes, and I looked him in the eyes. He thought it was mercy. I watched the hope flood into his face, that old familiar hope, the certainty that Dad had arrived and the broken thing would now be made whole. He grabbed my hands and began to make promises through his tears, the way he always had. He would change. He would pay back every dollar. He would testify against Lila, give them everything. If I would only make the call, hire the lawyer, do the thing I had always done. I let him finish. I owed him that much. One last time, the courtesy of being heard. Then I spoke, and I kept my voice as quiet and as level as I had kept it in the courtroom, because what I had to say did not need volume. It only needed to be true. I told him to stop lying, not to me, to himself. I told him that Lila had not made him do anything, I reminded him that he had not been drugged, or threatened, or deceived. He had sat at my table week after week and watched my hands shake. And he had reached for the salt. He had read a document with his father's life inside it. And he had picked up a pen. And the loop on the capital C had been the same loop I taught him to make when he was 8 years old. No one had moved that pen but him. He shook his head and said he had been afraid. Afraid of her. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of the future. And I believed him. That was the worst of it. I told him I believed he had been afraid, but I told him, too, that fear explains a man. It does not absolve him. And that somewhere along the way I had failed to teach him the difference, because I had spent 30 years making sure he never had to feel the weight of a single choice. That, I said, was my crime, and I would carry it. But the choices in that courtroom had been his. He asked me in a small voice, the voice of the boy on the train, whether I still loved him. I have thought about my answer many times since, and I have never wished to change it. I told him the truth. I told him that I loved my son, that I would love my son until the day I died, but that the man kneeling in front of me was not my son. My son had been a boy with a soft heart who cried at his mother's grave, and somewhere over the years that boy had been replaced, slowly, by something that wore his face and carried his name, and felt nothing when his father came apart at the dinner table. I was not refusing to save my son, I told him. My son was already gone. I had been mourning him for weeks without knowing it. He had no answer for that. There is no answer for it. It is the one verdict against which there is no appeal. The officer steps forward, gently, and said it was time. I stood, and I helped Casey to his feet, because a man should not be lifted off the floor by a stranger when his father is standing right there. For one moment, we were close enough that I could have embraced him. I did not. I simply looked at him, and I let him see that there was no anger left in me, and no hatred, and that this was somehow worse than either, because it was only the cold, clean, empty space where a son used to be. I told him goodbye. Not in cruelty, in finality. The way you close a file you know you will never open again. Then they led him away down the long hallway, and he did not look back this time, and I did not call out. I watched until the grey door at the end swallowed him. My only child. The boy I had run behind on Kedzie Avenue with my hand on the seat, letting go a second before he knew. I had let go again. This time I would not be running behind him. This time there was no seat to hold, and no fall I could prevent, and no version of the story where my hand made any difference at all. Bellamy came and stood beside me. He did not say anything. He had known Casey since the boy was in middle school, and there was nothing to say that the empty hallway did not already say better. I had walked into that building an old man they intended to erase. I walked out an old man who had buried a son who was still breathing. The case was closed. The cost was counted. And I was, for the first time in many years, entirely alone. It has been 4 months now, and I am no longer in Chicago. I sold the house. I could not stay in those rooms, with that kitchen, with the chair where Megan used to sit, and the mantel full of a family that no longer exists the way the photographs promised. So I packed the few things that still meant something, and I drove north until the city fell away behind me, and the land opened up into hills and water. I bought a small house on the edge of a lake, in a town too small to have a traffic light. It is nothing like the home I left. The floors creak, the winters will be hard, and the nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile down a dirt road. But the air here is clean, and the water is still in the mornings, and I wake without the sound of sirens or the weight of a house that was slowly being taken from me. I am sitting on the porch as I tell you this, with a cup of black coffee going cold beside me, watching the fog lift off the lake. There are no pills on my counter. There is no one in my kitchen pretending to love me. For the first time in a long while, the quiet around me is just quiet, and not the silence of something being hidden. People ask me, the few who know the story, whether I am lonely out here. I tell them the truth. Loneliness is not being alone. Loneliness is sitting at a full table surrounded by people who are smiling at you while they count the days until you are gone. I had that for months, and it was the loneliest I have ever been. This, the lake and the cold coffee and the creaking floors, this is not loneliness. This is peace. I do not know exactly what will happen to Casey and Lila. The cases are still moving through the courts, slow and grinding, and I have chosen not to follow them closely. I gave my statements. I handed over the file I spent my life learning how to build. The rest belongs to the system now, and to the other men in other cities who may finally get the answers I helped pry loose. That is enough. I do not need to watch the ending to know I built it right. I have not stopped working, though the work looks nothing like it used to. I do not hunt killers anymore. Instead, twice a week, I drive into town and sit in the back room of the public library with a dozen people my age, and I teach them the only thing I have left worth teaching. I show them how the kindest voice in the room is sometimes the most dangerous. I teach them what a financial predator looks like, how the warm hand on the arm and the gift that seems like love can be the opening move in someone else's plan. I teach them to ask questions, to keep their own counsel, to never sign a thing they have not read, to trust the quiet itch at the back of the mind that says something here is not right. I cannot give those people back the families that failed them, but I can give them the one weapon I had that saved my life. I can teach them to see, and there is King. My grandson is 9 years old, and whatever his father became, the boy is still clean. His mother, Casey's ex-wife, has let me stay in his life, and once a month she drives him up to the lake, and we fish off the end of the dock and say very little, the way men who understand each other do. The money I fought to protect is still there, still his, waiting for the day he is grown. I did not save it for revenge. I saved it because somewhere in all of this, there had to remain one thing that the appetite did not get to eat. If there is one lesson I have carried out of the ashes of my family, it is this. We are taught that to love our children is to protect them from every hard thing, to catch them before every fall, to pour our whole lives into making theirs soft. I believed that. I lived it for 30 years, and I built a man who could watch me die and reach for the salt. Love without limits is not love. It is surrender. And unconditional love should never mean unconditional surrender. Sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is finally stop holding up the walls and let what is rotten come down so that something honest can be built on the cleared ground. The fog is almost gone now. The lake is bright and still, and somewhere out on the water, a single bird is calling. I am an old man who lost a son and found, late and at terrible cost, the courage to stop saving people who only wanted to be saved so they could keep on taking. If you have ever had to walk away from someone you loved to protect your own life and your own peace, I would like to hear about it. Tell me your story in the comments below, and stay with me, because there are more of these to tell, and none of us should have to learn these lessons alone.